Check ready? This economy is currently struggling for several reasons, one being birth dearth. A catastrophe in which there are not enough babies being born to replace the current population. Drew DeSilva from the Pew Research Center reports that 27 of the 30 countries and territories globally with the largest 65 and older shares are in Europe. The effects on countries' populations are severe. Michael Meyer of Newsweek reports that Germany could shed nearly a fifth of its 82.5 million population over the next 40 years. This is incredibly problematic because there is a significantly smaller population and workforce contributing to the country's economies. The impacts of birth dearth cannot be understated. According to the IMF, it will lower potential growth and likely place a large burden on public finances, pensions, and benefit schemes and health provisions. Another problem, according to Liz Alderman of the New York Times, is the lack of demand for exports within the EU and the subsequent inability of governments to spend sufficient funds to correct the recession. However, an influx in refugees could be a key solution to Europe's downward economic spiral, not only because they can help to counteract the severe population decreases, as the IMF explains, but because they can also contribute heavily to the job market. According to John Stone of The Independent, economists from the European Commission find that the large influx of people from Syria and other conflict zones is likely having a positive effect on growth, employment rates, and long-term public finances in Europe. In fact, the IMF reports that an increase in refugees will lead to significantly higher GDPs across Europe in the next 2 years. This is because, as Edward Bruma of La Trobe University writes, refugees increase consumer markets for domestic commodities, create new markets, bring in new skills, provide employment, and fill vacant employment positions. In the long term, the benefits are even more sizable. The IMF continues to note that by 2020, integration of refugees into the job market could spur GDP growth of up to 0.5% for the EU as a whole, and 1% for countries that take in substantially more refugees, like Germany and Austria. Over time, this growth has key impacts for both refugees and citizens of host countries. First, Stone from The Independent explains that host countries are likely to see lower budget deficits in the long term because of migrants' contributions, meaning more spare cash will be available to spend on public services. This is essential because in the status quo, Stone finds that refugees receive less in benefits than they contribute through taxes and working. Second, host countries see huge boosts in job creation. The reason for this, according to Anna Swanson of The Washington Post, is specialization. She writes, as refugees come in, they typically fill jobs that require few language skills. In contrast, people in the host country move to jobs that require more native skills. The specialization of workers make companies more productive, which allows business to expand. In Australia, Michael Safi reports that migrants who arrived as refugees reported the highest proportion of their incomes that year from their own unincorporated businesses. Refugees are able to keep nations' populations afloat, and in the process, start and contribute to businesses, which is why countries of the world should accept them. Contention 2, national security. In the status quo, a majority of refugees seek shelter in refugee camps near conflict sites. As the United Nations Refugee Agency reports, over 5.1 million registered refugees are looked after in some 60 camps in the Middle East alone. However, with this crowding of refugee camps comes an increase in radicalization. As Josh Hampton of The Hill explains, refugee camps are fertile ground for breeding extremism. This happens for several reasons. First, Hampton notes that the generally squalid conditions in camps provide terrorist organizations with convincing propaganda for recruiting. Second, as Michael Finley of the University of Texas explains, the apparently hopeless conditions in which refugees find themselves upon fleeing to refugee camps leads to their potentially joining militant groups. Accepting more refugees into a country, rather than forcing them to reside in refugee camps, lowers the chance of a terrorist attack. Alex Naraste of the Cato Institute explains that a more expansive refugee policy with adequate security checks that resettles large numbers in safe countries can drain the swamp of potential future terrorist attacks and decrease that risk. By accepting substantially more refugees into countries, terrorism can be prevented and countless lives can be saved. Thus, we urge you to affirm.
Carl Survey.
Whitman.
And most importantly, the judge.
Yeah.
All right. Hendrickson negates the resolution. We begin by observing as the World Bank finds the largest percentage of refugees are found in countries neighboring the countries of origin. Refugees prefer to settle in neighboring countries for two reasons. A, lack of traveling money. Josh Wood from The National explains refugees are caught up in brutal and often inescapable poverty and debt. B, cultural preference. Ruth Bender from the Wall Street Journal in January explains many refugees cite cultural estrangement as a reason why they want to return home from Europe. Either by force or preference, refugees on net have a higher probability of ending up in neighboring, less developed countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey more often than developed ones. This means the affirmative must consider the realistic implications of their relocation advocacy. Contention 1 is safeguarding stability. Gil Loescher from the University of Notre Dame laments the cost of hosting refugees falls disproportionately on nations least able to afford such strain. Large refugee populations strain resources and perpetuate poverty. The RAND Corporation corroborates refugees cause neighboring states to divert resources away from state capacity, building, and core infrastructure. Perhaps more astonishing is the instability that comes as a byproduct of refugees. Aydin Salihan from the University of North Texas finds that an increase of refugees by 100,000 raises the probability of militarized interstate dispute by 96.5%, and such a shift in refugees nearly doubles the risk of conflict. This is uniquely problematic because developing governments cannot handle an increase in conflict. The Brookings Institution writes states fail because they are consumed by violence. Allowing state failure will only exacerbate the crisis in the Middle East that caused the refugee problem, especially considering the root cause of these problems was the violent civil war in Syria. In the world of pro, where neighboring states have to divert even more resources from critical infrastructure to refugees, neither short-term nor long-term protection can be granted. This is because the Global Policy Forum writes, failed states can no longer perform basic functions. David Carmen from Harvard University concludes, failed states increase refugees and they create insecurity in the states that surround them. A policy of acceptance would only increase instability for not just all refugees, but civilians in the Middle East as a whole. Thus, contention 2 is assured destruction. The lives of not only global citizens, but also refugees are put at more of a risk when the solution is accept refugees in the world of pro. Their advocacy assures destruction. Alexander Betts, in his book, Refugees and International Relations, explains, an increasing number of host states respond to refugee situations by pursuing policies of containing refugees in isolated and insecure camps. The solution in the world of pro would force neighboring countries to deal with a substantial increase in refugees through camps. The impact of these camps is a loss of stability in the host country. This manifests in a multitude of ways. A. Infrastructural overload. Ola Harari from Columbia University explains, the refugee situation has overloaded an already outdated infrastructure. The World Bank quantifies the impact of Syrian refugees on Lebanon's economy is $589 million. This is a problem for the long term because the UN explains the breakdown of infrastructure coupled with ethnic violence creates the conditions in which factional warfare develops. B. Radicalization. Roma Baidan from Arizona State University writes, the circumstances in camps breed conflict and act as a catalyst for refugee radical militant groups. Michael Finley from UT quantifies when the refugee flows change from the 25th to the 75th percentile, the count of transnational terror attacks increases by 91%. And the final impact is C, civil war. Aydin Salihan from UNC again explains, refugees upset the ethnic balance in host countries. Large migrant inflows tilt the delicate ethnic balance in the host society and sort of intergroup conflict. Statistical analysis bears this out, as Glitch from the University of Essex finds for every 100,000 refugees, the probability of civil war increases by 114%. And for these reasons, Carlos and I are very proud to negate.
Can we see that University of Essex card you just read?
Yeah.
At the bottom of your case? And if possible, can I just see that during cross, or if you guys prefer, I can take cross.
Sure. You can see it during cross, but do you mind if I also see something from you? It's the 2020 integration stuff. I think it comes from Edward, I think so, or the card after.
Yeah.
I got it, don't worry. Okay.
It's under points 16 and 17.
Okay.
Thank you. Sure. 16, 17.
Everybody got what they need?
Yeah.
Card west? All right.
Are you ready for crossfire?
Yes.
You can take the first question whenever you feel ready.
Okay. Oh, are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let's begin. So you talk about how when refugees go into neighboring countries, there's this conflict, right?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, if the countries like Lebanon and Jordan don't accept them, what's the current state of like Syria and other places? Like, is there still going to be conflict?
Okay, so new conflict can happen in multiple ways, like that's what we delineate the impact. So if it's not like civil war, like the conflict we just described, it will be terror that happens within these countries like Syria or Lebanon.
Okay, and like, so what's the problem? Like, should we just let that continue?
Obviously not, but however, we should not affirm to exacerbate the issue at hand, obviously, because like that's what we're explaining. So when we're going to like on your first contention about the birth problem, how is like the decrease, like why is the refugee situation a unique solvency for this?
Sure. So right now, Europe is currently scheduled to lose like a ton of its population, right? Almost 20% in Germany. So the thing is, there's no other way, like you can't suddenly have a ton of kids, right? That doesn't solve the problem. But when you have all these refugees come in right now, you see that you can keep this problem from getting exacerbated in the future, right? You have millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of refugees coming into Europe, and at that point, not only do they have kids, and
so like if China was able to enact like the one-child policy, right? So why couldn't Germany enact like the reverse and like have an economic like I don't know, like benefit to having more children?
I mean,
like why can the government do that instead of having
we're
refugees?
We're not here to argue like Germany's new policies. Like I don't think we need to talk about what they should implement. But what I can tell you is that uniquely, when you have these hundreds of thousands of refugees coming into Europe, that's where you see this population growth. That's where you see that the economy stays afloat because you have all these people who can fill jobs not only now but especially.
Okay, and just one last question on this topic. So why would the refugees want to stay in these countries? Like why would they not want to go back and like try to? If they're home, like once like Assad's out and like the civil war's over, why would they not want to go back to Syria to avoid this like cultural estrangement?
So one, what we talked about in our first contention is that there's a ton of new jobs and a ton of new economic opportunities for refugees in Europe and for in probably neighboring countries as well. But the problem is like it's not so easy as saying that they can just go back to Syria because the reason they're leaving in the first place is because there's all this violence, all these towns are being destroyed. So there's not probably a lot that they can go back to. I'm not sure it's fair to say that they'd want to go back. However, what I can tell you is that regardless, there's all these economic benefits and quality of life benefits in Europe. So I think it would make sense that they'd want to stay there.
All right, thank you.
Can I just ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Sure. So can you explain, like, you're talking about in your observation how they only go to neighboring countries, right?
Yes.
So does it matter if there's also a lot of them going to Europe too? Should only weigh that equally?
Okay, so here's the problem. That's not happening. They're not going to Europe as equally as they are developing countries like in the status quo right now. The reason why is like what we warned by saying first, they can't go Europe because like of the lack of money they have to travel, and second, cultural estrangement. Even like if like in this like debate, like we have to look realistically. There's barriers preventing them from getting to Europe. You can't just like fiat they automatically get to Europe.
So then my question is that how are there already millions of them in Europe?
Okay, we're gonna take some breath.
Are y'all done with?
Yeah, sorry, yes.
No worries.
Do a little switch. Okay, there we go.
Yes.
All right, so,
I'll start it now. It's,
Okay,
you know,
yeah.
good, yeah. All right. Everybody got their own computers back?
Yeah.
There you go, all right.
That's what we get on prep, and I got 1 minute and 4 seconds.
I only had 1 of 3, so the bank error in your favor, I guess. All right.
I think they're trying to cheat us, prep.
All right. Opponents ready? Judge ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Partner ready? Great. Let's begin. start at the top of their case where they read you these observations, right? There's a couple of key problems here. The first one is they tell you it's most likely to go to non-neighboring countries, but when the resolution tells you that countries of the world, not countries in the Middle East, should accept substantially more refugees, it makes sense that refugees are also going to be going to places like the European Union because it's just across the Mediterranean Sea. They try and warrant this by telling you there's a loss of money, but remember, we solve back for that when we tell you refugees are ultimately going to be making money in the long term, and then they tell you that cultural preference means that refugees want to stay close to home. The problem is we're going to outweigh this, and it doesn't make sense that refugees are going to be able to stay close to the home, because at the point where they tell you these camps are overloaded, and at the point where Syria is in a state of crisis, it makes more sense for refugees' safeties for them to move to countries in the EU and overseas. But with that in mind, to move to their first contention where they talk to you about stability, there's a couple of key problems here. First of all, they try and tell you that these developing countries are going to have to divert fees. But the problem here is there are other international organizations that can help contribute fees to cover whatever costs my opponents try and tell you about, right? When we're looking at the status quo, when we're looking at a pro world, we aren't saying that suddenly organizations like UNHCR and like the UN are suddenly going to disappear, right? There are outside organizations that can help cover those costs. But second, they try and tell you we're going to be losing infrastructure, but that doesn't make sense at the point where the GDP of the countries is going to be going up. Remember what we tell you, in case we tell you that the GDP of countries is going to be up, that's going to be an ultimate net benefit. That means more infrastructure, not less. Then they talked about increased conflict, but there's a couple of key responses. First of all, we're going to see conflict going down because if anything, we're solving for national security because we don't see radicalization. But second, the important thing to remember here is this argument is completely non-unique, right? Their argument doesn't explain why more refugees in a country leads to conflict. It just says that refugees in a country leads to conflict. My opponents have to prove to you specifically why accepting more refugees and not the amount of refugees we have now is going to lead to an increased amount of conflict. If they can't do that, you can't weigh this contention. Move to their second contention where they talk to you about destruction. There's a couple of key problems here. First of all, they talk to you about camps, but the problem is, especially in the European Union and other developed countries, these camps aren't going to actually materialize. If you look to youractive.com, he says that David Mancom, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister of Immigration in Canada, explained how his country managed to address the refugee crisis by building up permanent structures and institutions. Currently, Canada is accepting more than 13,000 Syrian refugees on its soil, and the rest of the 12,000 are expected at the end of the month. At the point where these developed countries in the EU and places like Canada and the rest of North America are going to be accepting refugees, they tell you that's not going to happen. At the point where we're telling you it is happening, and these refugees aren't going into camps. If anything, they are being restructured and resettled. That's going to be a net benefit for refugees. We aren't going to be seeing this negative about camps they talk about. But the reason you're going to want to continue to weigh that is because when we're telling you that refugees are going to be continued to resettled, you don't see these negatives they talk to you when they tell you that camps are bad. But then they give you these ideas of radicalization, right? But there's a couple of key things to remember here. First, you're going to want to cross-apply our second contention where we talk about national security. Remember, the reason that's going to be going down is because, as I just told you, refugees aren't going to be going into camps. If anything, they're going to be resettled. That decreases the amount of potential terrorism that's going to happen. But second, even if you don't buy that, the refugee process is so strict that it's going to take, it doesn't make sense the terrorists would target refugees as a way of becoming terrorists. If you look to The Economist of October 2015, they say that if a potential terrorist is determined to enter America to do harm, there are easier and faster ways to get there than by going through the complex refugee resettlement process. That's why they find that after refugees are referred by an American embassy or the United Nations, they are screened by the Department of State Resettlement all over the world. That means that it doesn't make sense for any potential terrorists to go and try and enter these countries because it's going to take them too long. It doesn't make any sense. Then finally, they talked about civil war, but there's a couple of key problems. First of all, they can't prove to you an example of this actually materializing in the real world. The second reason you're not going to want to weigh this argument is because it's completely non-unique. Again, my opponents have to prove to you why this is something specific to accepting more refugees and not the current refugees we currently have. We aren't here to debate whether countries should accept refugees at all. We're here to debate whether they should accept substantially more. And the third reason you're not going to weigh this contention is the impact they give you this University of Essex card. It says that these statistics they're reading you didn't actually materialize in the real world. They tell you that it didn't actually line up when they looked at the data they gathered from countries. At that point, you can't even weigh their argument, and thus you're going to want to vote out.
Do you want to take first?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to start. She's prep. How's 17 years? 18 years? So, we have 143 remaining.
Yeah.
Sorry. Robert Mosquito. Robert, are you good?
Yes.
Good over here? Yes. All right, Judge, just before we begin anything, I'm going to give a brief overview and then go down the affirmative case. Or actually, a brief overview that makes more sense to put on the negative flow. Then I'm going to touch on some things that they said and then down their case.
Gotcha.
All right. Robert, good?
Yes.
The most important impacts in the round are going to be the long-term impacts because simply this is going to be a long-term crisis. We need a way to solve it in the long term. That being said, they made some critical responses to our case that just simply don't make a lot of sense. On our framework, they respond by saying that they can still get to places, but don't let them downplay how difficult it is to travel across the Mediterranean. Then they make a critical mistake by not responding incorrectly to our first subpoint here, where we tell you that there is a lack of traveling money. They say they're going to be able to make money in the long term when they get to countries. Sure, that doesn't interact with our warrants. Refugees are still poor and they're not able to get to these developed countries, which means that way you extend Wood from the National, who tells you that because of poverty and debt, they're going to be staying in the developing countries. Right there, let's get into our contention 1, where they talk about how they can go like these other organizations that are going to help them, but recognize that they don't get to advocate for other organizations. Look what the UN's doing in the status quo. It's not enough, right? They don't get to say that the UN magically vamps up its system. Then they talk about how GDP is going to go up, but all of their evidence talking about growth in GDP was developed countries. Make them prove that developing countries' GDP is going to go up as well. Then they talk about how these camps aren't going to create more problems, but recognize that they say that they're going to resettle. But the only argument about resettlement that they give you is that Canada is going to allow 30,000 refugees. That's not going to solve the problem anytime soon, unless they show you mass resettlement, which has a very, very low probability. You shouldn't look towards that argument. That being said, let's get into their contention 1 that talks about birth rates, right? Okay. The first big response is recognize they don't give you a link as to how these people are going to get there, right? Europe may be in a birth crisis, but that doesn't really matter because people still can't get there. But our second response is recognize that there's still this sort of skills gap. In fact, the Institute for Employment Research explains that only 15% of the Syrian refugees actually have training enough to get jobs in the workforce. In fact, the OECD explains that most refugees have a third grade education in terms of comparing them to Germany. But that's going to be really critical because even in the long term, they're not going to be able to fill the skills gap. Because Politico explains, due to the age of refugees, most of them aren't going to be able to get through a 3-year formal training. That means that they're not going to be able to solve these problems because they're not going to be able to get into the job force. But now, our biggest response is going to be that you can turn this argument against them. And they really put all their eggs in one basket here in the economy. But according to the New York Times, they explain that the political and far right are poised to become among the biggest beneficiaries of the flow of refugees. In fact, Jess McHugh of the International Business Times explains that support for the far right-wing parties has continued to grow as they capitalize on xenophobia. This is going to be uniquely problematic because, as Sabina Sadowski highlights, the extremist nationalist parties are going to try and create a Europe defined by barbed wire, national walls, border control, and protectionism. This is going to be really, really critical because, as the EU Commissioner for Migration writes, the policy of being able to have open borders is a fundamental right. And as Bloomberg explains, moving this and reducing this actually risks ultimately weakening the glue that holds the EU together. That means that the collapse of this policy, the policy of open borders in the European Union, is going to, quote, cost 1.3 trillion euros over the next decade. That's really critical because that means that when we have this sort of nationalist rhetoric that's going to happen in the world of the pro, it shows there's not going to be any solvency because in the long term there's going to be barbed wire, there's going to be more nationalism, and that's going to close the borders. It's going to cost more and more money to the European Union. Now they give you this IMF evidence that links to their impacts, but their impact, this evidence talks specifically about successful integration. This entire contention is contingent on successful integration. I definitely just proved successful integration is definitely not going to happen. They get no link to the impacts. Then they talk about security. A couple big problems here with this contention. First, Alexander Betts, that we read you in case, tells you that the way countries are actually looking at things, or the way that the countries are trying to solve it, are through camps. And that's really critical because the resolution shows you the acceptance of refugees, right? They have to look towards the biggest probability of how they're going to be accepted. And even if they can get to Europe, which we contend that they can't, at the end of the day, they're going to have to be put in camps because that's what these countries are looking at. So at the end of the day, and the world of the pro, you're going to get more collapse, you're going to get more problems, and you're going to damn refugees in the future along with the European Union.
Alright, you ready for cross?
1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, everyone ready? Great. Let's begin. How many refugees are in camps in Syria currently?
In Syria?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but those aren't technically refugees either. They're internally displaced people.
Okay.
But if you're talking about the neighboring countries, a lot.
Okay, actually, in Syria, only 20% of refugees or internally displaced people are in camps, right? 80% are in urban areas, right? Can you give me an example of any of these camps you talk a lot about actually materializing?
I think it's really important that we make a delineation between like this internally displaced people and refugees. Like because Syrian refugees that go to other places are more likely to be put in camps, like in Lebanon.
Okay.
But like people who come to Syria because there's more open space, yeah, they like if someone was to travel to Syria as a refugee, they wouldn't be put into a camp because Syria doesn't have the stability to do so.
Okay. Even so, like if you look to what the UN tells you, they tell you that only 1/3 of refugees are actually going to be in camps. But even if we don't prefer that, can you give me an example? Okay, right, you talked to me a lot about like how refugees can't get to Europe, right? But can we both agree that there are currently refugees in Europe?
Sure.
Right, okay. Have we seen any of these camps you talk so much about actually materializing in Europe?
Yeah, like places like Hungary, they're putting them in camps. Like that's how like, you talk about the screening process for the United States, right?
Right.
Well, there's also a screening process in Europe. Where do they go before they're actually screened?
Right, okay, so what we're
Into
telling you is they
camps.
have urban areas, right? Like, at the point where I'm telling you only 1/3 of refugees are in camps, that's going to be something to what?
Wait, can we see that evidence?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have a question. So let's talk about your contention one, like the economy, right? So
Yeah.
let's say there's not successful integration. What does your IMF evidence say is going to happen?
The economy? Okay.
Yeah, what's going to happen to the economy?
What's going to happen to the economy
If there
is
isn't
basically
successful?
we aren't going to see a change, right? If we don't have, what we tell you is that refugees lead to an economic benefit.
No,
but actually-
your
Okay.
evidence is contingent on, quote, like successful integration. What happens if there isn't successful integration?
Okay, what we tell you is they're going to
No,
be
what does
successful.
your evidence say?
Our evidence tells you is exactly what you're telling me, right? Like, if we have the successful integration, which we tell you is what's going to happen, and what is already happening, that's when we see the GDP growth.
Okay, but what I'm asking is, if there isn't successful integration, what happens in the world of the pro?
I can't, like, predict the future, right? Like,
Well,
I
the
don't know if
IMF
we don't have
can't. Your evidence says that there's going to be a 0.4% reduction in GDP
Okay.
and an increase in
But that's
unemployment.
like relying on the whole idea, right, that we're going to see like 100, like 0% of successful integration, right? At the point where we're telling you that if we see successfully integrated people, that's going to lead to a GDP increase, that's going to be important to weigh. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so you talk a lot about like this immigration resettlement, right? But if so many people are having trouble getting to the EU, how can we see that we have thousands of refugees in Hungary, in France, in Germany? How do we see that's possible?
Well, let's look at the comparative, right? Because you're only telling one part of the story. There may be thousands of refugees in Hungary, but there's also millions in Lebanon, and they're stuck
Okay.
there because they don't have enough money.
Why are there millions in Lebanon and not in countries like Britain, for example?
Well, those
or
are the
in,
two
like,
warrants that we give you at the
Switzerland?
top of the case.
No.
We say there isn't enough money, that comes from Wood, but we also tell you that because of cultural estrangement, people are actually
Okay.
coming back
So-
because, okay.
Yeah,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Here's my problem with that, right? Like, if refugees are able to get to Germany and Hungary, I don't understand why they're not able to get to the EU, for example, or for Switzerland. The reason they aren't is because the policies aren't accepting enough to take in those refugees. That's why we see these people not going to these developed countries you talk about. And you wanted to see that UN word?
Please.
Okay. Here you go. It's like right there.
You pulled it. We were about to do the same thing. Okay.
All right, you ready to go, or you stop? Oh, yeah. That was good. Got you one. That's time.
We're gonna run some prep too, starting now.
Wait, weren't y'all running prep?
Yeah,
No,
no, that was you guys.
No, we were not, because y'all read go give your
Were you counting as our prep?
I thought so, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
We gave you the cards.
Okay. Okay. That's
Well, we're running more prep now anyways.
I was a
so,
little confused.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay,
Okay, so starting our prep now.
We are out of prep.
Yeah,
Cool.
we
Okay.
can figure out some way to.
It's okay. It's,
Yeah,
it's not
sorry
a, it's not a
about
big
that.
deal. No
Okay.
worries. I was very confused.
Starting our prep now.
Okay.
Okay, so that was 50 seconds, so I think we have 6 seconds left.
Okay.
All right. Opponents ready?
Hold on.
Oh, sorry.
I'm in the right place there.
Opponents ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Judge ready? Everybody ready? So I'm just going to go over the two main voting issues in today's round.
Yeah.
Before I start, I'll do an observation. Everyone ready? Let's
Yep.
begin. So just remember what we respond to on their framework in my opponent's case, right? They tell you that we only have to look to countries neighboring the Middle East, but remember what we tell you, you have to look to Europe as well. They tell you that it's not impossible for refugees to get to Europe, but there are already millions of refugees in Europe now, and when you see that countries are accepting more of them, when we implement this policy, when you affirm, there are going to be more refugees going to Europe as well. Now move on to the first important voting issue in today's round, which is the economy. And look to our case, right? A couple of things we talked about. Start with birth dearth. My opponent's responses to birth dearth is one, that refugees can't get there, but remember, there are already millions of refugees in Europe. You have to give that some credence. Then they tell you that there's a skills gap. So when, even if there are people like refugees in Europe, they can't find jobs. But remember what Swanson tells you in our case, which is that specialization is the main reason for this job integration that happens, right? Because when refugees who have low skills take these low skill jobs, then you see natives in the country move to high skill jobs, and so you see that specialization makes the economy more cohesive and more successful. Then my opponent's other response is about political theory and like the far right, but remember, they never prove to you that this happens. It's just a theory. You have to look to the fact that we know refugees are going to Europe, and that's really important because of the key economic impacts. One, the IMF finds that there's 0.5% GDP growth in all the EU and 1% in Germany. That's really important because you see that with this economic well-being, there's also, as Stone tells you, more services provided to refugees. Even if they don't have jobs, they're getting more benefits. And then they tell you that we don't show you there's economic growth in the developing world, but then look to the Brookings Institute, who finds that there's 2.5% GDP growth in Lebanon despite the refugee crisis. So you see that there's growth everywhere. Now move on to the second voting issue, which is conflict. A couple key things here. My opponent's only response to our own second contention is that countries have refugee camps. Remember that only 1/3 of the refugees are in those camps. You see that people are in the real world, so by getting them out of the refugee camps, you decrease conflict. Now on their own case, a couple of key turns. First, they talk to you about like safeguarding health and stuff, but remember, the problem is that they say the only reason that there's less infrastructure is that there's this conflict, but when you get rid of these radicalized refugees and get rid of these camps, you actually see that the radicalization goes down and there's less conflict. Remember what we tell you about Canada on their second contention, is that Canada has found ways to integrate the refugees, not put them in camps, and when you see that countries like Canada in the developing world, not these developing countries, integrate refugees, that's where you see radicalization decrease.
You have to be.
You're right.
Actually, foreign affairs article. Yeah. All right, Judge, just for your benefit, a little overview. I'm gonna start like an overview Carlos gave, so you can float in the same spot. Then I'm gonna go on the affirmative case, and then why you vote for the negative case. Okay. Carlos, are you good?
Yes.
Walt, Whitman, and most importantly, Judge, are you good? Okay. Remember, Carlos tells us in the rebuttal that's the long-term impacts are most important because the long-term decides how we solve after the crisis in the first place. Going back on the affirmative case, they talk about this big birth population and like how they're gonna have the economy is gonna improve. Remember what Carlos gives the most critical turn in today's round is the New York Times evidence that tells you that the open border policies are going to go away, that Angela Merkel is already enlisting. Remember, the radical far right is growing. That's really critical because the biggest link that connects their whole contention to their impacts is integration. This integration will not happen because if the growing right increases, that means xenophobia increases. When xenophobia increases, that means that's cultural estrangement. That's what we talk about in our own framework. These refugees will not be able to go in Europe. Their impacts will have no link at the end of the day. Going on to contention concerning national security. Remember, they keep talking about camps. However, like Amnesty International tells us, Japan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, they have zero resettlement policies. That means there are camps, and they're misconstruing what the article says, but we'll continue when we go on to our own case. So moving on to like why are we voting for the negative today's round? And that's because we're advocating for stability to stall back, like preventing the crisis from ever happening again. Specifically, let's start on our framework. They talk about how they stall back and like there's millions in Europe. First off, there's thousands in Europe. That's like statistically not true. Second, they don't stall back because remember, the travel money happens before they can stall back. This doesn't make sense whatsoever. Cleanly extend would. Moving on to our first contention now with safeguard stability. Notre Dame tells us that disproportionately developing countries will be paying for this, and this is why Aydin Salih says for every 100,000 refugees, there doubles the risk of conflict. That's really critical because we're ignoring developing countries. Do not let them focus on developed countries. Let's go on to the second contention, how we protect stability through assured destruction. The two most important impacts are A, through radicalization. Their only response is no camps. They say they solve through like GDP, but remember they don't solve like through GDP because we've already like removed the integration link in their first contention, so they don't solve back. Radicalization happens. This is exactly what UN tells us. There's no infrastructure. That means ethnic violence happens. Finally, going on like radicalization, it's not specific. I read their magazine. It talks about all refugees, not Syrian refugees. For these reasons, Carlos and I are very proud to negate.
You guys ready for grand?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Alright, everyone ready? Okay, cool. Alright, so you guys talk about a lot about this far right in the EU, right? Okay. Like you guys talk about that we're gonna see a decrease of like the Schengen policy, right?
Sure.
Okay. So why would we not, like, if the EU is currently divided over how refugees are going to be taken into Europe and which countries are going to take where, couldn't we see a similar decrease of this policy or like cutting back on this policy?
Okay, no, so
what we're saying is that the brink happens in the world of the pro. We say that like right-wing policy in the status quo is growing. That's because of the growing xenophobia on refugees. What do you think is going to happen when millions more refugees, by your own logic, are going to try and come to Europe?
Like if you want his...
So, can I answer that?
Sure.
Is that okay? So what I think is going to happen is if we stay in the con world right now where the millions of refugees who try to come to Europe are just going to be shepherded into a couple of set countries, that's going to create more divisions between these countries, and that's when we're going to see these decreases on these policies. Well, if you look to Max Rosenthal and Mother Jones, he says that this refugee influx is pitting the EU states against each other, and that already Germany and other countries are threatening to put up borders. So exactly what you talked to me about is already happening.
So I have a question. In the world of the pro, do all of the European countries just magically agree on a policy?
Okay, I'm
no,
not
right?
sure.
They all have their own individual policies. That's like the most probable thing that will happen.
Okay, so even so, like currently what the problem is countries like the UK are taking in no refugees, and countries like Germany are taking in millions of refugees. That's what we see the divisions happening right now.
Okay, but how does that interact with our argument?
Okay, so what you're telling me basically is that we're going to see these borders being put up, and that's problematic, or that's going to be the big problem in today's round, right? At the point where I'm telling you those are going to definitely happen if we don't solve this refugee crisis now by having more countries take in refugees.
So when have you said you're going to solve the crisis? Like prior to right now, have you said your advocacy solves the crisis?
I'm not advocating for solving the crisis.
So how are you responding then?
Okay, so your specific point, right, is that we're going to see these borders being put up because xenophobia is going to increase in Europe, right? I'm not like...
Yes.
Okay.
Theoretically, right.
What we tell you is what's actually going to happen, and what is happening right now is because there's such divisions in which countries are taking in refugees. Countries that are taking in the most, like Germany, are threatening to put up these borders now, not 10 years away, not 5 years away, but now.
Okay, so
we'll clear this up.
Let's move on to other things. So let's talk about like the Civil War impact from our second contention. Sure. Now you said there's never been Civil War. How many years though have we been in, let's say, the Afghan Civil War? Because I'm pretty sure it's been 37 years of an Afghan Civil War, and so there is historical precedent of civil war and radicalization happening in the Middle East.
Okay, definitely. There's a precedent of radicalization happening in the Middle East, but what we're telling you is you yourself tell me in your last speech that we need to look to Syrian refugees specifically. So where have we seen a country with Syrian refugees on the brink of civil war?
Okay, I would say Lebanon.
Okay, they're on the brink of civil war?
Yes, we talked about, like, that's exactly what I extended in my summary when I explained, like, Lebanon, because the infrastructure is collapsing, it's going to have civil war, because the United Nations says when there's no infrastructure, ethnic violence happens. Ethnic violence is civil war.
All right, we're going to take our remaining 6 seconds of prep, starting now. All right, thank you. All right, opponents ready?
Yes.
Judge ready?
Yep.
Partner ready?
Yeah.
Great. Let's begin. Judge, there are 2 main voting issues in today's round. The first one you're going to want to weigh is economic stability. Remember what we tell you in our case from Swanson, who tells you that the reason we're going to see economic stability increasing is because we see these refugees increasing specialization. They move into these countries, that's going to lead to people who are currently there moving to higher jobs. That means that the rising tide is going to lift all boats. Everyone's going to be benefited. And the reason that's important is if you look to what IMF says, they say that GDP in the EU is going to go up by 0.5%, and in Germany alone, it's going to go up by 1%. My opponents try and respond to this and tell you that we need to look to developing countries too. But remember what Josh tells you in summary. If you look to Brookings in Lebanon, where they tell you we have this massive refugee crisis, we saw the GDP go up 2.5%, the highest it's been since 2010. So clearly this is a recurring trend. We're going to see economic stability, and the reason that's so important is not only does it solve back for the birth dearth we're currently seeing in the EU, but it also solves back for the infrastructure my opponents talked to you about. They tell you that we're seeing these massive infrastructure problems and lack of funding when we see GDP going up. That's going to solve back for these problems. That's going to be key because it's going to be able to help solve back for these problems my opponents will tell you are so important. But even if you don't buy that, move to the second voting issue, that's going to be lives saved. We've talked a lot about camps, but let me clarify right now. Currently, we're seeing from the United Nations, they're telling you only 1/3 of refugees are in camps. That's the reason we can tell you that we're seeing terrorism going way down. Even if you don't buy that, remember what we tell you from Canada, we're seeing these resettlement programs. The reason that's so important is we increase national security. We aren't seeing this radicalization they talk about. We're solving back for that. They try to talk about civil war, but remember this isn't going to happen because first of all, they can't provide you an example of this actually manifesting itself with Syrian refugees. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, remember we're solving back for conflict because people are going to be wealthier, better off, and we're seeing a decrease in national security. The last thing I want to touch on is we've talked a lot about how these refugees are going to get to Europe, but let me clarify this right now. What they tell you is they're telling you refugees aren't going to be able to get to Europe, but at the point where they've already gotten to Germany, at the point where they've already gotten to Austria, the reason they aren't getting to these other countries is because these divisive policies exist that certain refugees go to these countries where there's a mass amount of refugees and other refugees go to and there are countries that have no refugees. That's the reason there's this policy they talk about. That's the reason we're going to see the dissolving of this policy. That's going to be important in today's round. Thus, you're going to want to vote ask.
Sure. Judge, just as a roadmap, I'm going to, same overview that Robert gave, then I'm going to touch on their 2 voters, and then our arguments.
Okay.
Good over here?
Yes.
Robert?
Yeah.
And Judge? Okay. We all agree that the long-term impacts are the most important. Let's get into their 2 arguments. The first one has to do with the economy, right? The only thing that they're saying is that essentially, like to our response about political integration, how it's not going to happen, is essentially that it's not happening now, so these borders are going to go up now. But they miss the internal link. What we tell you is that the reason as to why these sorts of policies are going to go up is because of the refugees. They try to tell you that there are millions in the European Union right now. That's not true. There are only hundreds of thousands. The reason that's really critical is because when substantially more come, that bites into our link about how this is going to increase the right-wing movement. When that happens, there's not going to be successful integration, which is what their contention is contingent on. When there's not integration, their own IMF evidence said there's actually going to be a 0.4% reduction in GDP. Then they try to give you this Lebanon example, but recognize you cannot make that comparative. You cross it off your flow because the EU doesn't have the same political sphere as Lebanon. We don't see this type of right-wing politics in Lebanon. We only see it in the European Union. That's why it's unique. That turn is pretty substantive because it means it's going to reduce the economy as a whole. Then they talk about security, but they concede Alexander Betts, who tells you that most countries are putting them in camps. They say that 1/3 of of refugees aren't going to camps. But when we looked at their evidence, it talked about 1/3 around the entire world, not specifically to refugees in the Middle East, which is really critical because that accounts for people in Africa, which obviously don't have the stability to have camps, which means that number isn't necessarily skewed. Or is skewed, rather. Now, the biggest voters on our side are going to be how specifically we're winning the framework, which is going to shape your vote. We tell you, they don't respond to this in the last speech. comes from wood. They tell you they don't have enough money. They can't get to these developed countries. That's really critical because when they can't get to the developed countries, that bites into the link in our contentions that talk about how it's going to decrease stability in developing countries. We tell you from Salih Han that it's going to increase conflict. But more importantly, the two impacts that are going to be the most probable are A, on infrastructure. When these refugees happen, like increase the infrastructure, we tell you that it's going to increase the amount of war. Robert extends the UN in the last speech that tell you that because there's a lack of infrastructure, it allows for this violence to perpetuate. And that only happens because there isn't enough money and because refugees are being forced into these developing countries, which happens in the world of the pro.
Good round. Good round. Start.
Good round.